Will Hughes-Jones. You're the production designer for Bridgerton, set during the Regency era in London. Now, right off the bat, in that first episode of the series, it establishes so many of the locations, including the Bridgerton home, the Featheringtons, the Queen's Palace. How much work and preparation had to go into the show before even a single frame was shot?
Wow, yeah, a lot is the short answer. We because it was a show that was different from anything I'd really done before. The brief that I was given by Chris Van Dusen and Shonda was to create a Regency world which was dialed up, was hyper real, so it had to fit with our modern audience, and so it had this. It was like a Regency world, but not as we know it, and therefore, by doing that created a lot of interesting hurdles to get across. So we spent a long time. We travelled the whole country, to be honest. First and foremost, myself and Sarada McDermott and the team went from London up to Liverpool and then down to Bristol, over to York. So we covered the whole country in about 3 days in this crazy road trip on trains and buses and cars, before we settled on our base. And then once we'd done that, after talking with Chris, it was very clear that we needed to define our worlds quite carefully. So, for example, the Queen's world, Queen Charlotte's world, we're lucky enough that we have the places that Queen Charlotte inhabited in our, in the country still. So we went to Wilton House, which we know Queen Charlotte stayed there for 3 days with George at some point. And that was the area that we used for a lot of the Queen's Palace. And then when it came to the Bridgertons and the Featheringtons, because they're such defined characters, we very quickly realized that we needed to actually build their houses. So we built both the Bridgertons and the Featheringtons, which allowed us to create the color palette that, working with Ellen, the costume designer, who'd started before me. So she had quite a defined palette already. That allowed me to bounce off that palette and create the Bridgerton and the Featherington worlds, which, weren't like anything you would find in a country house, because, the Regency period was, 200 plus years ago. And we needed to create houses that weren't brand new, but weren't 200 years old. And so that defined that we wanted to go with this bright, vibrant look of our Bridgerton world, which meant that we had to build it. So when preparing for it, there was this very long prep period where we traveled, we found our locations, and we built quite a big set of sets all in one go.
And when you're, creating this period world that also has elements of the modern, is it more challenging than when you're doing a period location that's based strictly on research and reality, or is it more freedom and does it open up the possibilities?
It's one of those things where myself and Gina Cromwell, my set decorator, very early on had to have conversations with ourselves and say, what are we making here? Are we making a period show which is true to the period, or are we making something which is more a pastiche of the period, which is what we decided we were making? So with that gave us the freedom to, we always start with reality, we always start with research, but the way the scripts are written, sometimes there's little nuances within the script which aren't necessarily 100% period accurate. So we would have to cherry pick our moments to say, okay, well, that's not entirely the way it would have been. And so we bend with the wind in order to tell our story. Because ultimately, we're storytellers, we're not historians, and we're telling the story of the Bridgertons. So for me, it's much more liberating because we can be historically accurate, but when it doesn't suit, we can slightly push it, but never push it so far that it's ridiculous. So that's sort of, I found that I was the sort of the sentinel to the period the period thing. You know, we had to. Quite often I would say we can't really do it like that because that wasn't invented for another 100 years, and then we'd have a conversation about it, and quite often it would be decided that we would need to change it. And then, you know, if there was a difference of, say, it hadn't appeared for 20 years, we go, well, maybe we can do a version of it. Who's to say that, you know, the Bridgertons and the Featheringtons and our world, they were the uber rich of our periods. They would have had the latest of everything. So we could play that game a little bit.
And when you're building sets like this, and you have so much detail to think about, from carpets to architecture to furniture to artwork, windows, mirrors, all of those little details, like how much are you considering like character, and because there are a lot of pastels, especially like in the Bridgerton house, so you're thinking about color there. Like, it seems like a lot to juggle, I'm sure.
It is, and we, again, going back to the initial research, when we went out on our road trip, one of the key tools that I took with me was a laser tape measure. In every room we went into, and we went into hundreds, I would measure the width, the length, and the height. And what surprised me is how high the rooms are in these big country houses. And very quickly we worked out that actually there was a sort of standard height for these rooms. And that, in our build world, was what I feel created the seamless quality between going from location to the sets, was because we made sure that we had the volume within the rooms. Now, when it came to the colors, we wanted to define the worlds very carefully. So we made sure that after long conversations with Chris and what had been done with costume and looking at the locations, we sort of zeroed in on a very narrow color palette for the Bridgertons and a very narrow color palette for the Featheringtons, so that the audience immediately knows whatever room, if it's the first room they've ever gone into, they know it's a Featherington room rather than a Bridgerton room. And in the same way with the Queen, we made sure that her palette was narrow enough that the audience didn't necessarily need to know where they were in the world, but they knew that they were in the Queen's world or the Bridgerton world. So these were very, very strong considerations when we were working everything out. We also felt that, you know, the Bridgertons were old money, they're quite classy, and, you know, they have their intelligence. So there was this softness and intelligence to their architecture, whereas the Featheringtons were more showy. They wanted to be seen. They wanted the latest of everything. So the furniture that they had, you know, we based it on, there was a furniture designer at the time called Thomas Hope, and his furniture was very sought after in this period. And so we made sure that the furniture the Featheringtons had was in the style of Thomas Hope, and all their sort of decoration was all about show. So those were the sort of two areas that we concentrated on to create those characters within the spaces.
And with not only those locations, but the series goes to any number of balls and parties, and how many sets were built for the show overall, would you say?
I knew you were going to ask that. I forgot to check, but it was over 100. And the balls were an interesting one because we had to theme them, and every time it became a bit of a running joke that every time we read in the script, it was the biggest and the best ball we'd ever seen. And we, because of our schedule that you have to, the filming schedule that we have to work to, we had an occasion where we had to do 3 balls in 3 days in one location. And that was probably our hardest, tightest ballroom setup, because in order to actually achieve our schedule, you can't find a building that has 3 ballrooms in it. So we ended up using a location where we used their hallway as one ball, their salon as another, and then actually a conference room as another. So there were lots of sets. We were on location for, it seemed forever, but we went from Bath to Bristol to Yorkshire, and all around London, and even down to the south coast to Ringwood, for there's a scene in the academy where of Arts where we go into this fantastic portrait room, and that was in a country house down in near Southampton. So we travelled a lot, but to create this show and to create the scale and the beauty, that's what it required.
And how much, especially when you're creating the world outdoors, like were visual effects used to like extend certain scenes or create certain scenes? How much did that come into it?
We had, I'm not going to lie and say we didn't do visual effects. We did, but as much as possible, we liked to try and get it in physical terms as we could. So Vauxhall Gardens, the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, was a classic example of that, where actually there's a drone shot at the beginning of that scene where you see the whole gardens, and about 40% of that is CG enhancement. But when we were on the ground, all the fireworks, all the lights down the avenue of lights, the bandstand, the dance hall, all of that we actually created, and we had 3 nights of doing fireworks displays, which everybody got very bored of very quickly. But the final scene, you look at it, and quite a few of my friends have said, "Oh, well, you obviously CGI'd that," and I was like, "No, we did that for real." And then the dream sequence that we have within the show, that was all. There was nothing CG about that. We did the whole thing. But then the actual square where the Featheringtons and the Bridgertons live, that was a CG, and that was a CG construct, because we spent a long time trying to find the square, which was quite specific, and because of modernity, it just became impractical to try and shoot on a real square. So we just went for the perfect houses we could have, and our CG guys and girls built everything in between. So when you're standing at the Bridgerton house, I can now tell you it's no secret, that is in South London on Blackheath, and the Featherington house is in Bath on the other side of the country. So when they look out at each other, they were looking a hell of a long way to see each other, but it was actually, a CG construct for that. So we used it when we needed to, but we weren't tethered to it. It wasn't the thing that made us do things.
In addition to all of the indoor work with building sets and houses and settings, there's a lot of outdoor scenes and parties that go throughout the season. How do those challenges compare? Because you're dealing with light and weather and all that.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting one, because we started filming in about June, and we were still filming February the following year. So we went through all the seasons, and the debutante season is a very short period of time in the early summer. So it's a sort of 8 to 12 week period that we had to keep all our florals the same. So there was a lot of assets used to create our gardens, because we had a Queen's garden party that we filmed in December, and there was absolutely nothing alive in that garden. We had to bring it all in, and on the morning it was so cold, everything was covered in frost, and I had all my team out there with heat guns and blowtorches melting all the ice off all the plants to make it look like a beautiful day. We were constantly wiring on blossom onto trees everywhere we went. And then finally, for the final sequence where the Hastings Ball, which is in the courtyard of the Hastings house, we had it raining in there, and we shot that in February, and it was just above freezing outside. So we actually built that in a studio and had a huge rain rig over the whole set. The whole courtyard was a water tank to take the rain, and the water was heated up to a temperature so that it didn't steam, but allowed all our cast to be in their very lightweight dresses, summer dresses, in the wet and not freeze to death. So I think our biggest challenge was probably the weather and keeping a constant look of beauty throughout the whole year.
And throughout the first season, did you have a particular scene or episode or set that you were especially proud of putting together?
I think there's, I mean, many of them, but I think the Hastings Ball, I think it was more about the reaction of the cast and the crew when they walked onto the set. You know, you could see people physically being emotional from walking in there because it was such a beautiful place. And Chris, the showrunner, he was very kind in his praise for us for building it. But it was one of those sets. I mean, for example, the detail that we went into to get it right, we took one of the costumes, which were predominantly this sort of powder blue, and we had our greens people repaint all the roses so that they were the same color as the dresses, so that there was a synergy between the costumes and the set. And you know, that was a really exciting set to do. I think the other one was Vauxhall Gardens, because we did loads of research into what Vauxhall Gardens was really like, and there were some little strange idiosyncrasies that we couldn't quite get to the bottom of. For example, all the buildings looked like they had lights on them, and obviously there was no electric light in that period. So we surmised that they were actually mirrored discs or mirrored balls, and that's the only thing that we could work out. We could come up with that's what it was. And so, you know, the Christmas decoration department was very happy to find us buying hundreds of thousands of probably, I think it was 5,500 baubles in the middle of the year to clad our buildings with these beautiful baubles, and then having the fireworks. You know, that was a sort of boyhood dream to be able to say, yeah, I'm going to do a really big fireworks display. So for me, those are the ones I really enjoyed. But the whole house, the whole idea of the Bridgerton house and the synergy that we created with the costumes, and, you know, I was very proud of as well, because it feels like a real place.
Well, I want to congratulate you on your work on the show, and all of the detail that went into it. It definitely all shows up on the screen. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks a lot. Take care.